Vanakkam. My name is Ed Davey. I've been the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Kingston and Surbiton since 1997. And I'm really privileged to represent many British Tamils in the House of Commons. I consider many of them my friends who live here in New Malden, in Tolworth, in Berrylands, in Chessington, all over Kingston and Surbiton. They're a very important part of the Royal Borough of Kingston and make it one of the most diverse and interesting places to live. When I first understood the issues facing British Tamils was in one of my weekly surgeries. I do surgeries to help people, and a local Tamil family had come to me because their nephew had disappeared. He'd been arrested by the Sri Lankan army and they hadn't told the family where he'd been taken. And it was helping that family, trying to trace that individual, that really helped me understand the appalling human rights and injustice that so many Tamil people feel. And then helping many Tamil people who are seeking asylum and wanting to be refugees in Britain, hearing what they had been through really opened my eyes to the need to campaign for justice and peace on the island of Sri Lanka for the people who are there, for all the people, but the Tamils who are suffering such injustice. So I'm delighted to continue to fight for the Tamil cause, and I thought it was very odd when the Sri Lankan government called me a white tiger because of my views, and I will continue to fight like a tiger for the British Tamils.
So thanks, Ed. We've got a few questions for you on some of the issues affecting the Tamil community. The first one, what justice mechanism and accountability process would you endorse in Sri Lanka?
After the war came to a close, there were so many allegations of war crimes against the Sri Lankan army that I've argued from back then that we needed an independent investigation, but an international independent investigation. And I've called for that since 2009 in the House of Commons. My party, the Liberal Democrats, have argued strongly for that. And within the government that we've just had, Liberal Democrats pushed to make sure that the British vote at the United Nations Human Rights Council voted for a UN investigation. Of course, we know that UN investigation has been hampered and hindered by the government of Sri Lanka, who refused to cooperate with that. But I still think it's a very important investigation, but it may not do the job finally. We may need to go further. And I think President Sirisena's refusal to cooperate and refusal to back a UN international independent investigation is frankly unacceptable. And the next British government's got to make it clear that until we have an international independent investigation where the government of Sri Lanka cooperates, we will not rest.
And what is your position on the deportation of Tamil refugees to Sri Lanka?
In my advice surgeries here in Kingston, I do them all over in New Malden, I do them in Tolworth, I still meet many Tamil people who are under threat of deportation. It doesn't happen as much as it used to, but it still happens too regularly. And I have to work for them as individuals and their families to try to stop those deportations. And unfortunately, while we've managed and been successful in a number of cases, there have been the odd case where we've lost. And they've even had a case where someone who was deported, was then captured in Sri Lanka and tortured, and then escaped again. And I was representing him on his second asylum case. So that experience working for local families, local Tamil families, makes me absolutely certain that we have to have a moratorium on the deportation of Tamils back to Sri Lanka until we can be absolutely sure that their human rights and their civil rights will be respected by the government of Sri Lanka. That needs to stand up in the courts, and part of the way we will know that is if the government of Sri Lanka actually brings to justice some of those people who perpetrated this torture and perpetrated those crimes.
If the new government fails to make meaningful progress on cooperating with the UNHRC and on ensuring justice for the victims by September 2015. What steps do you think should be taken against it?
I think if the government of Sri Lanka continues to fail to cooperate with the United Nations investigation, we have to get tough. And I think that starts by a resolution, first of all at the United Nations Human Rights Council, noting and condemning their failure to cooperate with that international investigation. Then we actually have to consider whether it should go to the United Nations Security Council itself for consideration. And that has to then lead on potentially to sanctions, targeted sanctions against individuals in the regime. We have to hold people to account. If the United Nations has investigation and it is undermined by the government, whichever government it is, then I'm afraid that the United Nations has to show its authority, and those are the only ways it can do it.
Do you support the call for an investigation into genocide against the Tamil nation?
If you look at the history of the way the Sri Lankan government has treated the Tamil people, not just in the last few years but actually over several decades, the way they have breached their civil rights, their political rights, their cultural rights, and refused very reasonable requests for the devolution of power, then you do begin to question the way the Tamil people have been treated. Now, genocide is at another level, but given what happened during the war and certainly in the last period of the war, there must be a case for the international investigation, the independent international investigation that I've called for, that Liberal Democrats have called for, to look at the case on genocide as well.
And finally, do you support the Tamil nation's right to self-determination?
I've always been a strong believer that we need to find a political solution, a constitutional solution to the issue in Sri Lanka. It needs to be peaceful, in my view. It needs to respect all minorities and the whole population in Sri Lanka. It needs to respect the right of self-determination of the peoples who live on that island. How that then actually manifests itself needs to be open to democratic political debate. But the voice of the Tamil people has been trampled on and ignored for far too long. That's why the international community must be much stronger. It's why I've always believed that Britain in the EU needs to make the case, needs to support civil rights in Sri Lanka, and why we, working with others, Canada, the United States, need to put pressure on others in the region, be it India or China, to bring the Sri Lankan government to see the need to uphold human rights and political rights in the island of Sri Lanka for the Tamil people.
Just a few questions about your own constituency of Kingston and Surbiton. There's obviously a large Tamil population in Kingston and Surbiton. What would you like to say about your experience of representing that community?
First of all, I'd say thank you. Namri. I've really enjoyed working and campaigning with local people on domestic issues here in the constituency, whether it's been on things like the health service, whether it's been on our schools, whether it's been on issues like policing. At the moment, for example, there is a problem in Kingston, actually in parts of London, where there are organised criminal gangs who are targeting Asian families, and the increase in burglaries against Asian families, including Tamils, is a real problem here. I've seen it in New Malden, I've seen it in Tolworth. So those are the sorts of local issues that I want to work with local Tamil people. I'm delighted that the Liberal Democrats have Tamil councillors, people like Tai Taialan, Yogan Yoganathan, on Kingston Council, so I can work with them on those local issues. But I'm also keen, of course, to continue to campaign on national and international issues.
And finally, what would your message be to Tamil voters in Kingston and Surbiton?
The election on Thursday, May the 7th, is going to be very close here in Kingston and Surbiton. It's always a close battle, actually, between myself for the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. While Labour can win in other areas, they can win in places like Merton and Croydon and Ealing and so on, elsewhere in London, Labour know that they can't win here. They always come third. So lots of Tamil people who've traditionally voted Labour actually vote Liberal Democrat here as the best way to beat the Conservatives. I also like to think that some of those Tamils voting for me vote for the Liberal Democrats, on our values, on our support for human rights, our support for international justice. But I also like to think they vote for me, Davey, because they like the sorts of things that I do and work hard on. So it is a vital election. I don't believe Conservatives represent Tamil people in this country. I've had real arguments in the coalition trying to get the Conservatives to do more on this issue, particularly the rights of Tamils in Sri Lanka. I've had arguments with people like Liam Fox, who frankly is no friend, I think, of the British Tamils. I've worked with Labour colleagues. I worked with David Miliband when he was Foreign Secretary, and I work with other people in the Labour Party now to make sure we continue to campaign as British parliamentarians for a better deal for Sri Lankans. So I hope if you're a Tamil living in Kingston Surbiton, or and that may mean New Malden, maybe Tolworth, maybe Chessington or Berridans, if you're living in my area, you will go out and vote on Thursday, and please vote for me, vote Ed Davey, vote Liberal Democrat. Thank you. Nandri Vanakam.